So just to get us started, what are you working on right now?
I have been trying to decide if I'm going to do an eighth book. Well, if my eighth book in the series I'm working on, No Merciful War, is going to be back in the Southwest Pacific with Jimmy Ardana and Danny Evans. And it would concern what's going on in Papua New Guinea in April and May of 1943. And Jimmy's a fighter pilot. Danny's a bomber pilot. It's a pattern I've had mostly through my books. So you kind of get a broad feel for what was going on in the theater within the limits of fiction, of course.
That must have been an exciting time. That must have been an exciting time to be alive.
You know, it's funny how these small periods of time seem to enter our consciousness like they're forever.
Yeah.
America, of course, was only involved in the war a little less than 4 years.
Yeah.
World War II actually lasted from September 1939 to August of 1945, so 6 years and some change. And to this day, I can't think of it as anything other than this enormous stretch of time. And it's not. It's actually less time than the American Civil War, for example, back in the 1860s.
So just give us a little flavor of what this book is about. What happens? Just don't tell us the ending, but just give us a little flavor.
Well, I actually have already wrote the ending. Sometimes it's fun to do that, so you know what you're sort of aiming towards. And the conundrum that I faced was that there's actually not a lot going on at that period in time. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was won by the 5th Air Force. The Japanese sort of drew back a little to lick their wounds. American losses in the campaign were such that they had to just basically fight a delaying action, which is kind of what they'd been doing since early 1942. And the problem that I face as the writer of the story is that I'm going to have to try very hard not to do a bunch of things that I've already done a bunch of times before, which is they go out on missions, they get in trouble. Basically, I think what we're going to see in this story is a lot more character development of Jimmy Ardana and the cumulative effects of combat and what that could mean to someone who's a really, really good pilot. I have friendships with the people who flew fighters, mostly in Vietnam, but the psychology is the same. These guys aren't exactly like you and me. They're just a little bit nuts, and thank God for that. You know, but I got to thinking, what would happen if you keep flying to the limit of your abilities and someday you just don't believe you have any limits, that you can do anything? And that's the problem I think Jimmy's going to face. And I've got to really give a lot of thought to that.
What age are these characters? What age are these? Sorry, what age are these characters?
Oh, they're kids. When I was in my early 20s, I'd have fought anybody that claimed I wasn't a full-grown adult. Yeah. But really, when you look at youngsters nowadays, it's like that line from one of the Star Trek movies, I was never that young. And the reply, of course, is, no, you were younger. And the funny thing is, though, if you look at pictures of the pilots from that time, they're all in their typically between 20 and 25. You'd have brigadier generals and colonels that were 25, 26, 27 years old. And it was a young man's game. You had to have younger people in positions of fairly heavy responsibility, like colonels in command of bomb groups, for example, or fighter groups. That's more or less the equivalent of a regimental command in the Army. There was one guy that I read about who started off, he graduated from West Point in 1940, got his wings in 1941, went to the 19th Bomb Group in the Pacific as a second lieutenant co-pilot, ended the war as a colonel in command of a bomb group in England. So you see, he couldn't have been more than 26 or 27 at the time that happened. So just young kids.
That's incredible. All that responsibility and the stress. You were talking a little bit about the stress that they must have been under. So what did that do to them?
There's a very interesting book called Men Under Stress by two guys named Grinker and Spiegel, who were Army Air Forces psychiatrists in World War II. And the thing is that I've been carting this book around since I was about 18 years old without having read it. And I dug it out recently. And imagine it this way. Most people who become pilots have this almost unquestioning ability in their own ability, this unquestioning faith in their own ability. In fact, my character Jack Davis is going to sum it up in the novel that I'm going to write after this one as you got to have the faith of a Georgia cracker full of the Holy Ghost putting his hands in a gunny sack full of timber rattlers. Now, that may be a little more from my cultural background than yours, but I think you get the idea. You know, you got to have a lot of faith in your own ability. And it can't be, it's one of those things where if you question it, you start delaying decisions that you have to make like that. You stop doing things. And it hits fighter pilots a lot worse than it hits bomber pilots, because bomber pilots, they sit there and they have to take it. I mean, imagine what it would be like to be flying at 5 miles or even 6 miles above the surface of the earth. It's cold. You know, you're talking very typically temperatures in the below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, or what would that be for you guys? Like, heck, 20 or 30 degrees centigrade below, minus 20, minus 30.
Freezing. I'm not sure the exact, but certainly below freezing.
Well,
things would be freezing in the air. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other part is that most of the airplanes, especially the ones used in Europe, weren't pressurized. So you're basically in this shell that's open to the elements. The waist gunners in a B-17 are firing through an open port about maybe this wide. I don't know if you can see my hands, but I'm holding my hands about 3 feet apart and about maybe 3 feet high, something like that. I won't guarantee those dimensions. You're wearing even the pilots are wearing heated flying suits, gas masks, oxygen masks, a helmet. Typically before they start the bomb run or they get into a heavy flak concentration, they'll put on steel helmets to protect against the flak. They'll have earphones on, they'll have throat mics, big old flying boots. And now imagine, here you are, you're trying to fly with all this stuff on. The wind is screaming. And I don't know if you've ever been in an old piston engined airplane. I mean, a really big one. It's loud. I mean, it is loud. I flew in a B-17 one time. It'd be one of the best experiences of my life. You know, you can go to an old battlefield that was fought on the ground, but if you want to get a sense of what it was like, and it's only in the most marginal sense, because after all, you're not freezing, you're not having to suck oxygen through a mask, you're not wearing these big flying clothes, and most important, nobody's trying to kill you. That is what these kids were subjected to on every mission. There's a wonderful poem by a guy named Randall Jarrell, who was actually in the 8th Air Force during the war, and I can never remember all of it. But the end goes something like, I hunched, and the poem's called The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner. You know what a ball turret is?
Yeah, on the top.
Well, the ball turret is actually on the bottom.
Oh, on the bottom. Okay.
And what you have to do is you rotate the turret until the guns are pointing down. There's a hatch that opens. And when you open the hatch, what you see is that there's maybe that thickness of aluminum between you and whatever is 25,000 feet below. So you climb in there, and you have to be a small guy. You know, I'm 6'2". And, you know, when I was a young skinny kid, I was still 6'2". You couldn't have put me in one of those turrets. I'm not sure I would have gotten in one of those turrets. You've got you're essentially in a fetal position. You've got your feet on 2 pedals that turn the turret one way or the other. You've got the breeches of 250 caliber machine guns right next to your head. and you're fighting your war through a plate that's maybe a foot or so across. And let's see, that'd be I don't know, 20 centimeters, something like that. So
yeah, foot is
yeah,
good. Yeah.
it's a flat optical plate, and that's literally about what you can see. You're shut in there with your oxygen mask. You've got a little indicator up here that says which direction the turret is pointing, which is very important, because if people are going, bandits, 12 o'clock low, you want to be able to swivel around and look below the tail of the airplane. Otherwise, you're not going to know. Okay, well, no, excuse me, that's 6 o'clock, mixed up. 12 o'clock would be the nose of the airplane. So you swivel up, look at the nose, you look low to see where the fighters are coming from. Anyway, you're sitting in here and you're in all that flying clothes. Hence, I hunched in the belly of the state until my wet fur froze. Well, wet fur because you're sweating. You're scared to death. Then came the flak and the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. And that's always just it's a very affecting poem for me personally. I remember being in the Weeks Air Museum in Florida once and just standing in front of they had a ball turret like that. And I stood in front of that thing, wondering what it was that bugged me about it, until I realized, my God, fighting in that? There is no freedom. You were at the mercy. You always hear horror stories of the turrets getting jammed and you're not being able to get out. But imagine if you're in the middle of a fight, your airplane's hit, it starts to go down. You get the call to bail out of the airplane. Well, if your buddies aren't there to crank the turret open and let you out, you're not wearing a parachute in there. There's not enough room. You have to get out of the turret, clip your parachute on, and hope you can get out. Very typically, from what I understand, you were lucky if 3 or 4 people got out of an airplane that was stricken and going down.
And how many would be in the plane?
Well, it would vary. An airplane like the Handley Page Halifax typically carried a crew of 7. The American B-17 would carry 10. But sometimes you'd have extra personnel on board to act as observers or, trainees or whatever. A friend of mine was a navigator in the 8th Air Force, Colonel John Parker, who I based the character of Al Stern on, because John Parker, honestly, one of the best human beings I've ever met in my life. And John told me they were on a raid to, I think it was a place called Stettin, which is now, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, Zechin or some Szechin in Poland. But the Germans had synthetic oil refineries there during the war. And Bomber Command, RAF Bomber Command, and the 8th Air Force raided it a number of times. John said that the airplane ahead of him carried the group commander, the group intelligence officer, and 2 or 3 other observers. It was hit by flak, exploded, and just disintegrated. So,
what was the death rate? I read sometimes that they're very high in the command. There'd be very high death rates for the pilots and other crew.
That when I did my last book, the one that's just come out in December, I was shocked when because that was something that I sort of knew in the back of my mind that casualties were heavy, but I had no idea. For example, RAF Bomber Command lost something like 60,000. This is killed in action. That's not counting wounded or missing or taken prisoner. Something like 60,000 men in those bombers during World War II. In the 8th Air Force, you had a comparable rate, not quite as bad, but they said it was safer being an infantryman in the Army in Italy than it was flying in the 8th Air Force.
Yeah,
and
I had a relative. His mother left his room after he flew off and never came back. It left his room in England the way it was for many years, and he never returned.
When you start when you start studying these people, the thing that most strikes you is I love to fly. I never got my pilot's license because, just when I had the money, I didn't have the time. When I had the time, I didn't have the money, or just other, life interfered. But you get told, we don't get flying today like people back in the 1930s and the early 1940s got it. Back then, you were still, it was all that scarf in the wind, and you never knew quite if the old crate was going to hold together when you actually got it off the ground. And this was when an airplane that would do 200 miles an hour was a fast airplane for the day, especially, a big airplane. Supermarine built a racing plane that broke 400 miles an hour back in the early 1930s. And the same guy that designed the Supermarine Spitfire designed that racer. But, you're looking at this magnificent rate of progress in aviation. But today, the only thing you can compare it to, as far as technological advances, is the way computers have advanced. They just sort of appeared overnight back in the 80s, and all of a sudden, boom, and now look, you and I are talking on, you're in Ireland, I'm in North Carolina, and you're coming in really great. I hope I am too. But that's remarkable technological advance.
Yeah.
But the thing about it is, flying was an age-old dream of man. And when the Wright brothers got off the ground in 1903, what always amazes me is everybody was kind of like, so what? A couple of guys in a pasture in Dayton, Ohio are now flying around. Reporters used to go out there just to see if they'd crash. Mm-hmm. But then in World War I, people started to really notice aviators, and you start to get this gestalt going. You had barnstormers in this country after the war, and they sort of spread the same thing. And it was all about, in the 1920s and the 1930s, at least, aviation progress was a lot more about distance flying and speed records than anything else. Then, of course, you've got the preparations for World War II. Well, all that speed and distance flying came in handy when you're designing fighters and bombers, and that applied to everybody, all the combatants. But I think what it's hard for us to realize, again, I was just talking about the technical aspect of it, but this total love for aviation, there's an airplane going over my house right now. Part of me wants to dash outside to see what's going over, and I've talked to any number of pilots who got their training in World War II, and they said that's the way they were as kids. They'd see an airplane, they'd go outside to see what it was. On Saturday afternoons, they'd get friends together. They go out on their bicycles to the nearest airfield and hang around the airport watching airplanes, and maybe doing odd jobs for the mechanics, things like that. And, just totally absorbed in it. And these were the guys that grew up to be pilots and air crew in World War II. Almost everyone who went into pilot training had that idea that, man, I really want to fly. This is something my wife will always want to do. And now they're going to pay me to learn? Hot dog. Well, the only problem with that is when you get to some place like Papua New Guinea, where civilization is almost nil, or you're even in Britain, where civilizations existed for thousands of years, it gets a little bit different. You're not just flying for sport anymore. It's very real. And I've always wondered that aspect of change, when all of a sudden it's something you love becomes something that scares the living out of you.
So the book that came out in December, what's the title of that?
We Live in Fame.
We Live in Fame. And what's it about?
There was a little known event took place January of 1943, the Casablanca Conference. The American 8th Air Force was having a lot of trouble getting its act together to conduct strategic bombing in daylight over Germany. Sir Arthur Harris, who was in command of RAF Bomber Command, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill were both at that Casablanca conference, and they urged President Roosevelt to have his generals switch over to night bombing. Now, Sir Arthur Harris is an interesting, controversial figure in some ways, like our own General Curtis LeMay became after the war. But our guys didn't want to do it because, well, bluntly, our airplanes were all designed around the idea of daylight precision bombing. They just weren't able to do it yet. And I thought, what if we had a tasking? We're going to make an experimental squadron that's going to be able to fly at night and see how the 8th Air Force would have to do this. Well, you have to learn from people who are already doing it. And the main character of the book, Charlie Davis, who's been in the series since the first book, is one of the guys that are chosen to fly with RAF Bomber Command. And he goes to the Canadian outfit, 6th Group, and he's with 419 Squadron out of Middleton, St. George. So he flies 7 missions at night, and it's mostly about what he goes through there. And at the end of the book, they decide, well, I don't know if we're going to do this night bombing thing, Charlie, but we're going to put you in another airplane. I mean, we're going to put you in an American bomb group for now. Well, Charlie ends up having to save his crew using techniques he used from Bomber Command. And that's more or less the end of the book. There's a little more detail in there, but I should mention something about the story. The title. We Live in Fame comes from the Army Air Force song. The chorus goes, we live in fame or go down in flame. Hey, nothing can stop the Army Air Corps. So that goes back to how old it is, because the Air Corps was dissolved in 1941. But everybody all through the war called it the Air Corps, not the Army Air Forces. The point to that is it's mildly cynical. We live in fame because the alternative is going down in flame. And it was only when I started writing the book that the truth of that chorus really hit me. Yeah, those guys knew about it from day one, because they're basically started. The song itself now is called Off We Go Into the Wild Blue Yonder. And it's sort of like, yeah, we're told from the very beginning, but nobody really understands it's true. It's absolutely, totally true.
That's amazing. So what started you writing these books, Tom? What inspired to write these books?
Well, I've been writing since I was 14 years old, and mostly I saw myself as a science fiction writer, and that kind of never took off for me, although I haven't given up on it. And in the mid 90s, I started thinking, why don't I start, figuring out if I'm going to write a book about these guys flying early in World War II. And I've always been kind of a frustrated fighter pilot. There's a long story behind that I won't bore you with right now. I honestly believe in my heart that I could stick my hand into that gunny sack full of timber rattlers and pull it out if I had to. And, it's realizing that you can't do something that you dearly want to do sometimes will lead you into the next best thing, which is writing about it. And I've come to feel that level of immersion, I guess, is about as close as I really want to get, all things considered. Everybody that I've ever talked to that was in World War II, pretty much the same thing. They wouldn't give anything for the memories and the experience, but they'd never do it again. And that sort of informs my thinking a little bit. Imagine the will that kept these guys going. And that's another thing I tried to imagine. Do I really have that in myself? I don't think I'm a particularly brave person. I don't react to stress or responsibility any easier, or I don't bear it any better than anybody else would or could. But it always makes me, you have to sort of wonder, do you have that in you? Are you really would you really be able to do it? And that kind of curiosity sort of impelled me to write these stories, because here in America, we're not really all that thrilled with history. I don't know why that is, because to me, history is enormously interesting. But I think that one of the things I wanted to do was to create a homage, if you will, to honor these guys. Almost all of them are gone now. There's maybe a handful left. You're starting to see Army veteran, Navy veteran dies at 110 now. And a fellow named Rob Miner wrote a book about the last surviving American World War II veteran, which I think he called it The Last Word. Fabulous book. Great idea. Made me real jealous. But how I particularly got started was, have you ever heard of National Novel Writers Month?
NaNoWriMo.
That's it. I really kind of honed my craft doing that, because you know how it is. You'll sit there and you'll write something and you think, oh, this is really great. And then, you'll drop it. But NaNoWriMo, you got to sit down and write at least 1,670 words a day. Well, I did that from 2004 through 2018. Wow. And after that, I got busy with, a little more professional projects, and I haven't done it since. But I can recommend it to anybody who's thinking about a career as a writer. It is an absolutely fabulous way to kind of get over yourself a little bit, and just get the spark going. But in 2010, I mentioned I got my start as a science fiction writer, and I was writing a science fiction story I'd been working on for a long time. And I got about 6,000 words into it, and that was about day 3, I think, of the 30 days in November. And all of a sudden it was like, blink, nothing, totally blank, couldn't do anything. So after about 3 days like that, I got a little worried, and I sat down with my subconscious and I said, okay, what's going on? You don't do this. This is not something you do. And it was like subconscious lets in this burst of light from above, and you will write that book about the guys flying P-39s in New Guinea. And there was nothing I could do about it at that point, but write. And this is a true story, mind you. I sat down and I wrote 51,000 words in something like 21 days. And that book became Boxcar Red Leader, which is the 3rd book in the series.
Boxcar Red Leader. So where are they based? So your last book is about Guam, but where's most of it based? Where are they based? Where are the pilots based that they're flying out of?
Well, the first 4 books take place in Papua New Guinea. Well, that's not strictly true. The first book takes place in the Philippines, because I would be willing to bet that if you ask someone in this country, if we ever had people in the Philippines, unless they were in the service themselves and served in like Clark Air Force Base or Subic Bay, which I think we've not been there in 20 years or so. So it might be that there's nobody that really knows, oh yeah, we once had extensive holdings in the Philippines. In fact, if you go on Google Earth, you can still see a fortress. I don't recall the name of it right now, but it was called the Concrete Battleship. It was a U.S. Army coastal artillery post that literally looked like somebody had sawed a battleship in half. It had 2 big turrets mounting 14-inch guns and an observation tower that looked like something out of an old style dreadnought. And that sat in the mouth of Manila Bay. The ruins of it are still there. Wow. So you can see that on Google Earth if you want to look it up. Anyway, the first book takes place in the Philippines. The second book, A Snowball's Chance, takes place in Java, where the survivors of the Philippines fighting are trying to hold back the Japanese advance in January and February of 1942. What we didn't know at the time was that the Japanese were coming south to seize the oil in what was then called the Netherlands East Indies, but is now called Indonesia. the Celebes, Borneo. They wanted the oil because they had the Japanese home islands have almost no resources of their own. They have a little coal that they mine, but any kind of steel or oil or almost anything else except food really has to be imported. And some historians will argue, and I think there's a good point to it, that President Roosevelt accidentally kicked off the war by embargoing steel and oil exports to Japan in May of 1941. At that point, the Japanese realized they had, well, we've got about 1 year's worth of supplies here. What are we going to do about this? We don't want to just give in to Roosevelt. And that's when Yamamoto said, look, if you want to fight the Americans, nobody has anything in the Pacific to oppose us. We'll run wild for a year. After that, I'm not going to guarantee anything. And that, of course, is exactly what happened. So that's the first two books. Philippines, Java, Boxcar Leader takes place in the early days of the fighting in New Guinea from May and June of 1942. And then the fourth book, Thanks for the Memories, still in Papua New Guinea, but concerns the Japanese attempt to take Papua New Guinea by fighting overland across the Kokoda Trail in the Owen Stanley Mountains. And I've always wondered what they were really thinking, because I don't know if you've ever had a chance to look at the geography of the Owen Stanleys, but it's basically kind of like that. So you're going up these mountains. The highest peaks are around 15,000 feet. It's like a corrugated washboard. The trail is maybe 5 feet wide in places. You have to have pack mules, and you can't even use those. So imagine you're a Japanese soldier, and you're carrying all your kit, which, your pack and whatever you need to stay alive, your rifle, your bayonet, your ammunition, plus an artillery shell, which probably weighed 20 or 30 pounds, I guess. I don't know. But you're carrying that up a hill and then down a hill. It's raining. It's freezing cold at night. It's blazing hot and humid during the day. How they thought they could actually manage that, I'm not real sure. But the point is, in the event, they got within 20 miles of Port Moresby. They said they could literally see the searchlights from the airfield at Port Moresby during Japanese air raids. That's how close they got before the Australians stopped them. They had
an interesting and cruel culture, didn't they? It's a good thing we won, if you don't mind me saying we.
The Japanese fascinate me. Some of their art is just gorgeous. And after the war, some of their film directors, like Akira Kurosawa, they made just fascinating movies about their culture. And yet this same culture could produce things like the Rape of Nanking, where 1937, the Japanese took the city and raped, butchered, maimed, tortured, killed tens of thousands of Chinese civilians. It's as I understand it, to this day, they don't really acknowledge that it happened. At the time, even, I think there was a news blackout of it, more or less. But you could really say similar things about the Germans. Here's a culture that produced Goethe, Schiller, Beethoven, icons of Western civilization. And yet they also produced the death camps at Auschwitz. So I think it's more of a cautionary tale to the rest of us. Yeah, it can happen here. It can happen to us.
Of course, the fighter pilot culture now, we're moving towards all this drone culture, where they're sitting in a computer room with just controlling the drones. That's a huge part. And then we're going to into swarms of drones. So it's completely changed since then, and even since Vietnam, the culture, where I think the culture was similar, probably a little bit similar in Vietnam, but now we're into something completely different. And there hasn't been much of an air war, of course, in decades, really, has there? Afghanistan or Iraq, there wasn't much of an air war in any of those places.
Well, of course, the last air-to-air combat that I'm aware of was during the first Desert Storm campaign. Was that 1993? I'm probably got that year wrong. I know a little bit more about World War II than I know about modern times, I'm afraid. But I think there were some air-to-air kills in that war, and those were probably the last ones. You're right. God forbid we may see a little shooting in the air here in the near future, but let's hope not.
Let's hope not. So I think that was that's a good summary of your work. Is there any last words you'd like to say and recommending a book, particular book you'd like people to read?
Well, of course, I'd like them to read all of them, but I would, since it is a series that's ongoing, I'd say please do start with Everything We Had. It's in many ways one of my favorites, simply because, you know, that's where we meet Jack and Charlie, who are two brothers, and they're my main characters through the series. And that's where I'd recommend everybody start. It's hard to pick out a favorite because I think what book I'm working on is my favorite. Sure.
Well, that's been great. I really enjoyed that. I used to read a lot of war stories when I was younger, and they're captivating. Of course, I have no understanding of the real stress and real danger that these men face, and I have no idea how strong I'd be in those situations. I'd hope I'd be able to face up to it. But I really appreciate your time, and I think anyone who's watching this, you know, we appreciate your time and the great stories that you're making. So thank you again, Tom. That's great. And we'll post this, and I'll also send you a link. And it's great to see you again.
Well, it's good to see you, Lawrence, and thank you so much. I really enjoyed this, actually, even if I was a little nervous at the beginning.
You were good. Really interesting stuff. So thank you. And everyone, please watch for Tom's books. We'll also provide links as well at some point. So thank you, Tom. Okay.
Right. Thanks, Lawrence. You guys have a good day.
Bye.